Hi everyone, welcome back for our second segment. This segment we're talking about retirement planning. The question is, how much do you need to have in order to retire in the future? A little bit of math involved in this segment, but don't worry, it's a small amount. What we have to really do though is figure out a couple of things to answer that question. And first off, we have to define some things. So in order to figure out how much you need to retire, you need to know where you're starting from. So we need to look at a few items. The first item you have to look at is your cash flow. And the second thing you need to look at is your savings. So let's define some of these things. Cash flow. Cash flow is the difference between your income that you earn and your mandatory expenses, the things you must pay or somebody gets angry at you. So in our examples, we've been using $50,000 in income. And we've been saying 20% in taxes. So your $50,000, mandatory, you must pay your taxes, so now you're at $40,000. Well, on top of this, you have to pay for a place to live. You have to have food, you have to have clothing, you have to have transportation to get to work so that you can get your income. And if you have any loans, whether it's for a home or for a car or student loans, any of those loans have to be paid. All of those are mandatory expenses. Once you've paid those, whatever you have left is your discretionary spending. So let's say after all of this, our argument is you have $10,000 left in discretionary spending. Now, with this $10,000, you have three choices. You can spend it, you can invest it, you can save it. What's the difference? Spending's pretty straightforward. That's going out on vacations, going out for dinners, anything that you do for fun. Investing is long-term in nature and has an element of risk to it. So it's meant for long-term planning, like retirement, or it could be for kids' education, or it could be for buying a home, or for buying a car. But it's something where you're planning it, and it's for years from now. And the key is that what you're doing with the money has risk associated, so you can lose as well as make money on it. Savings is for emergencies, not things you've planned on. The air conditioning in the house goes out and you have to replace it. The car breaks down and you have to replace it. Those are emergencies and they weren't planned. And therefore, the money in savings should not have an element of risk to it. It may not grow much, but the whole point is it's there if you need it for an emergency. And then if it's a big enough need, your long-term investments can be added to that emergency side if it's needed. So it's liquid, but it's not planned for that. So now that we've figured this out, now we have to think about when and how much do we start saving. And I'm going to show you a scenario to help you understand this. For as long as I have been doing this, thank you, Kath. Kath is my video editor and she likes to chime in. But she's right, I've been doing this a long time. For as long as I've been doing this, I've been trying to convince young investors to start saving early, to start young. And the reason is the sooner you start, the more you'll have later because of compounding. And this is important because everybody says when I'm young, I don't have the money now. Well, let's think about it in a simple term. Most of us who work go out for lunch. On average, you probably spend about $12.50 for lunch. If one day a week you didn't go out to lunch, you brought in a lunch, and you took that $12.50 and you put it into your investments, over the course of a month, it would be $50. Over the course of the year, it would be $600. Not a lot of money. But if you started doing that when you were 35, and if it grew at 5% a year, just for an argument, your $600 a year would grow into $37,500. Now, if you did that exact same thing, but you started when you were 25, skipped one lunch a week going out, instead of $37,500, you'd have $68,500. $31,000 more. But think about it. That extra 10 years at $600 is only 6,000 of it. That's the strength of compounding. Start early. Save as much as you can, but start early. That's the critical element here. And we're going to come back to this at the end of our discussion. But let's take the next step now. So we've decided how much we're going to save. And we decided we're going to start it sooner rather than later. Yay. So now the question is, well, how do I figure out how much I'm going to need? So how do I forecast? What number do I use? And the answer is, that's a trick question. There is no single number. It's a range of numbers. Professionally, we run what's called Monte Carlo simulations. And these take all sorts of different scenarios about rates of return and inflation and how much you're putting away and all of this. And then it runs this 1,000 to 10,000 times. And it comes up with averages. And then it gives you the averages, says, well, within these ranges, this is what you should expect. And that's the key. When you're doing this yourself, you don't have to run a Monte Carlo simulation, but you can do the same thing. You use a range of numbers and average them to give yourself an idea. So you can use lower rates of return and higher rates of return, and you can use lower rates of inflation and higher rates of inflation, and lower amounts of savings and higher rates of savings, and blend them all together and see the outcomes. Now, historically, people used to say 10% is the average rate of return on the stock market over the cycle, and they typically were looking at 30 to 40 to 50 years. Well, if you start when you're 50, using 10% when you don't have that much of a cycle left is a mistake. The second thing is, what used to be accurate 40 and 50 years ago is not quite the same anymore. These days, I would tend to use slightly lower numbers. For good returns on the stock market, I would average 7%. And then I might do a 5 and a 2 and a 0, so that you have a range of earning nothing, and if you've been saving, what does that do for you? All the way up to 7%. But then the key is, you're going to not do this once and forget about it. You're going to do this every year. So over a couple of years, now you still have lots of times that you're forecasting, but you have several years of real data. And so you can adjust what your expectations will be. For instance, so let's say that 7% isn't accurate. You're actually on 10% on average, or 12%. Well, that's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. That's telling you that you're further ahead than where you plan to be. And that's the first thing you want to know is, where am I on my plan? Am I above plan, below plan? What do I need to tweak? If you're above plan, maybe you can afford to put away even more. Maybe you need to presume that the next couple of years are going to be worse. You may not change anything. You may keep your same averages that you were using to begin with because you're above plan. Maybe after 5 or 7 years, if you're still above plan, you can adjust what you think your rate of returns will be. That's why you keep coming back to this. So, next thing you have to figure out is, well, when do I retire? Most people use 65, but the reason 65 was used as a date or a time was from old data. 40 and 50 years ago, the average person lived to about 68. So by 65, you weren't in great health. It was time to retire. And now you only needed 3 years of savings. Now, if you retire at 65, when the average person lives well into their 80s, now you have to have 20 years of retirement savings. That's a lot of extra savings. But more importantly, and I've seen this again with many of my clients that retired at 60 to 70 or 65 to 70, is that they were in good health, and after 6 months they were bored to tears. They went back to work. So you might change what you do. You might change how frequently you do it, right? Maybe you spend more time doing charity work, and maybe you only work part-time. But all of that should go into your planning. We're still going to use 65 for our examples, but I would urge people to think about working longer just for your own health and mental health. I can tell you that I plan to work at this point well into my 70s. It's longer than a year or two. Thank you, Kath. I plan to work a lot longer because my job is very mental. So as long as I have don't say anything about my mental, as long as I have my mental facilities, I can keep working. Think about those things as part of that planning. But now you've done all of this, you've come up with when you're going to retire. Now we have to say, so how much do I need? How do I figure that out? Here's where the math comes in. Typically what you want to look at is your peak earnings. Ideally, you'd like to continue to maintain that lifestyle. Now, don't expect your expenses are going to go down much when you retire. They typically don't, right? You may spend a little less on clothing. You may spend a little bit less on going out to eat or something. But by and large, you're going to live the same lifestyle. The one thing that's going to change is your healthcare expenses go up as you get older. So that's an increase in your expenses. So anything that might moderate is going to be offset by that. For instance, you might move to a smaller home. And if you paid off your mortgage, yes, you may not have a mortgage, and that's a big expense. But that's going to be offset to a large degree by your health. And that depends on how healthy you are. So for your projections, plan on keeping these same expenses. So we need $50,000 a year in income. At retirement, if we figure we can get a 5% rate of return, that means you need to have $1 million to produce your $50,000 a year in income. So now turn it backwards. In order to get $1 million in savings, if you started when you were 25, you needed to save $8,766 a year at 5% in order to get your $1 million. Now remember, in our first projection, we talked about saving $600 a year, not $8,700 a year. More importantly, if you waited to 35 to get to that same $1 million, you needed just over $16,000 a year in savings, not $600. And on $50,000 a year, you're not likely to be able to save $16,000 very easily. That's why you have to start early. And that's why I tend to urge, start early, save as much as you can, because the numbers get big. Now, I hope this was helpful. It gives you a plan, a way to get started. Remember, it's just a plan. You keep reviewing your plan every year, and then you can tweak it as you go along. I hope this was helpful and you enjoyed it. And we have a number of other educational videos that we have in our playlist. Make sure you watch them. If you get questions, feel free to email me. Thanks for listening.